most people don't know you because you were on our show probably 12 years ago, but could you give us your credentials, where you studied? How are you the foremost authority on the Hebrew and Greek in Scripture?
Well, so I studied at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. That was many moons ago. And it was really an incredible experience to go to Israel, be able to live in the land that, Jesus, where he lived, of course, where King David lived, and so many others. And, to just kind of take it in each and every day. And so I'm really very grateful for that experience. I now live in Denver, Colorado. I have a Messianic church out here, or congregation, and I love going through the word. I love showing people. I get excited about it. I tend to geek out sometimes, and but it makes me happy when I can see that smile on people's face, because they're like, oh, it really makes sense. So that's what I love doing.
I've listened to several interviews that you've given before, talking about realizing the importance of knowing the Hebrew. It's funny that most people didn't, they know, but the Bible wasn't written in English. It wasn't written in English in 1611. There might be more to glean from actually inspecting the original language and the traditions and heritage at the time, so that you could better understand what's being said.
Yeah,
absolutely. And it's really unfortunate that so many seminaries today make Hebrew the secondary language instead of the primary language. Greek is really thought to be like the language that you need to know. If you have to choose between one of them, they would argue for Greek. And I think that is a big, big, big mistake. Yes, the New Testament did come to us in Greek. That's true. But Yeshua and the disciples were actually speaking Hebrew. I actually wrote a book on that, Discovering the Language of Jesus. And I argued and demonstrated that he was speaking Hebrew to his disciples. That was the mother tongue of all the Jewish people in the land of Israel in the first century. And, so if we want to understand Yeshua, we need to understand Hebrew first and foremost. And Greek is incredibly useful, just like English is today. But if you were to study the life of, let's say, a Chinese person, you might want to study Chinese, just kind of an idea there. And so that's the same basic idea, is that, Yeshua was speaking the language of his forefathers. He was speaking the language of King David, of the prophets. He was speaking the language of Moses. And that is the language that we need to really take in to get some of these sometimes they're nuances, sometimes they're big and bold discoveries, and sometimes it's kind of flavoring. And even in the New Testament, we find that there are what we call Hebraisms. They're just little phrases that don't make the most sense in Greek. We can sort of understand them, but they make a whole lot of sense in Hebrew. One of those is, standing on one leg, is what they say in Hebrew, whereas in English we'd say in a nutshell. You could translate literally in a nutshell into Hebrew, and people would be like, I wonder what that actually means, but if you say standing on one leg, then they all get it, right? And so that's the basic idea of why the language is important. And of course, there's a lot more to it as well.
Well, it makes perfect sense. And that simple fact alone, I don't think I've ever heard anybody speak of, yes, it was written in Greek, but they were speaking Hebrew. It's just genius. And I'm a chronological man. I like to read stories from the beginning, and it started in Hebrew, so it makes sense to me to know that.
Well,
exactly.
Very interesting. You've studied a lot. We have your book here, Corrupting the Image. We know there's since been Corrupting the Image 2 and 3. But it's very interesting. You make a Mount Hermon connection. You discover things that most people don't do when they read the scriptures, and even using historical evidence to back up the story of the B'nai Elohim who came down on Mount Hermon. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Oh, well, I can tell you a lot about that story. Yeah, there's a whole lot in there. And this goes back to one of those questions: why would a loving God destroy the world in the flood? It really seems incongruent. This is where a lot of skeptics kind of get their start. Many people were raised with this idea that there is this loving God, but then they start reading the Bible. They're like, wait a second, something doesn't make sense here. All right. And so we come to Genesis chapter 6. It says, when man began to multiply in the face of the earth and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were tovot, that they were good, and they took any they chose as wives. And then it says that there were Nephilim, there were giants on the earth in those days and afterward. All right, so that's this really weird kind of prologue to the flood. And that prologue is often discarded, thrown out, ignored by many, many scholars throughout the ages who've said, that's not really so important. It was Julius Africanus who sort of posited the idea that maybe it was the sons of Seth. He was kind of just guessing, and then it became more mainstream under Augustine, and then it became absolute fact under Calvin. And you didn't want to disagree with these guys because they'd burn you at the stake. At least Calvin would. And so this whole idea that the sons of God were just the ungodly line of Seth, or maybe they were the godly line of Seth who were marrying the ungodly line of the daughters of Cain and all this other nonsense, that became what was acceptable later on under the church fathers, etc. But if we go back to the first century, we find that there was a unanimous position and voice that the sons of God were in fact angels or fallen angels who came down. They commingled with women, and they begat this hybrid race known as the giants or the Nephilim. So then we have the book of Enoch, First Enoch, which is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it talks about in the days of Noah, the days of Jared, that 200 watchers came down on Mount Hermon. All right. So Mount Hermon is a pretty interesting name. It comes from the word cherem, which is basically to take an oath, to imprecate yourself, or to do yourself bodily harm if you do not keep your promise. That's the basic idea. And the name of that mountain has been Hermon since as long as we know. I mean, it goes back to the days of Joshua and before. In fact, we find this in the Ugaritic texts from about 1400 BC. And they talk about Mount Hermon as sort of being the Mount Olympus, if you will. In fact, it's both Mount Olympus and Hades at the same time.
Yeah. The gates of hell.
Exactly, right. Yeah. And there was a deified king of the dead who lived there, whose name was Og. How interesting. Okay. And they said that his other headquarters were at Ashdod and Edrei. Okay. So that's coming from Ugaritic texts, right? Now, obviously, the Bible says that, right? The book of Joshua specifically talks about King Og of Bashan, and that he had dealings at Ashdod and Edrei, right? So it's a perfect match of who this is. All right, so all of that is sort of later talking about what happened at Hermon. But if we go back to the book of Joshua, or we go back to the Bible, speaking about these giant or these sons of God that came down in the days of Noah, then according to the text, there were 200 angels that came down. All right, so that in itself is pretty amazing. All right, so it's really exciting, And so I started looking into this. I was writing my book, Corrupting the Image, Volume 2. And, when you're doing research, you have an idea of where you're going, but sometimes you make some discoveries that kind of blow your mind. And this was one that I just had no idea that I was even remotely going to discover. And I was looking at the evidence of this inscription, because there's an inscription that was found on top of Mount Hermon.
That's right.
And it was found by Charles Warren. So Charles Warren is kind of a legend in Israel. He found all kinds of stuff. Yeah. He was actually a guy who worked for Scotland Yard in England. He was a detective, and he went to Israel in the 1800s and made a lot of discoveries. Among them were Warren's Shaft, which it was probably the way that King David and his men got into the city of Jerusalem, and many other things. All right. And so he also went on top of Mount Hermon, and there he discovered this stele that had an inscription on it from Greek, or in Greek, and it's now resides in the British Museum. And so he translated it. George Nicholsberg of Harvard also translated it, as did the British Museum. So, I'm trying to track this thing down, and I find the English translation. And the English translation says, according to the command of the great and holy God, those taking an oath proceed from here. Mm-hmm. And I thought, okay, George Nicholsberg has equated this with the Book of Enoch. I'm like, that's cool. I'm with them. But I'm like, but it doesn't make any sense that it would be the great and holy God that would give this commandment, Yeah. I mean, I've got a problem with that. And as I recall in the text, it was the bad guys
that's right.
who had this idea. It wasn't the good guy who's like, hey, why don't you go down there and mate with women? That seems to be like a big no-no. In fact, God sent the flood as a result of doing that.
It doesn't add up.
Yeah. So I'm like, okay, something's got to give here. So, what you do when you're researching is you want to go and find the original source. Mm-hmm. All right. So I managed to track it down on the British Museum website. Mm-hmm. Saved me a plane ticket, which is really nice. And so I was studying this thing, and I'm just looking at it. I'm like, wait a second. It doesn't say hagios. That's how you say holy in Greek. It just doesn't say hagios. And I'm just staring at this thing, and I'm like, I may not be the foremost Greek expert in the world, but I know that is not the word hagios. Okay. And I'm just looking at it, and I'm like, it looks like the word batios. It's in the genitive, so it's actually batiu. But I'm like, it just doesn't make sense. Right. So I'm trying to track this word down, trying to figure it out. I'm looking in every Greek lexicon I can. What is batios? Right. And it's just not in there. It's not a Greek word. So then I kept looking, and I found it finally. It was in a grotto in southern Italy in the Messapian era, which I'd never heard of. I'm like, what is that? Right. But Messapia was a civilization that flourished around the 8th to the 3rd centuries BC in southern Italy. And there was they had their own language, and there were some inscriptions that were found in a cave that was really difficult to get to by foot. You could get there pretty easily if you were a sailor, right? And so in this cave, they found an inscription that mentioned Jupiter Batios. And I was like, oh, so, Jupiter Batios. Yeah. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. So now there's 2 places in the world where we found this word, right? On top of Mount Hermon, and in a cave in southern Italy. And of course, I'm thinking, what in the world is the connection, right? It just doesn't make any sense. And this language, Messapian, I'm not getting it. So according to some of the scholars, they're like, well, we think that Batios was an epithet for Jupiter because it was a place name. All right. And so you would often say, Jupiter of, I don't know, Rome, or, Jupiter of Syria, or something like that. That was kind of the idea. And I'm like, okay, that would make sense if there was a city named Batios. So I'm looking all around and looking on the maps. There's no city named Batios at all. And then finally, another scholar was saying there was huge evidence that it was, there was a lot of Semitic feel to some of the inscriptions. And because it was difficult to get to, this was probably brought by Phoenician sailors. And I'm like, oh my goodness, there you go. What is in the backyard of Phoenicia? Well, Mount Hermon. All right. So this epithet Batios was brought by the Phoenician sailors from Phoenicia to the area of southern Italy. All right. So I'm okay. So I have an idea of where it came from, but what in the world does it mean? Well, at the same time, I'm doing research on Enlil. Enlil is basically the name of Satan. All right. So I'll try to explain it slowly because there's a lot of moving parts here.
Yeah.
But most of us have read Isaiah 14, where it says, "How you have fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning," right, or son of the dawn, or something like that. And the crazy thing is, you don't find the word Lucifer anywhere in the ancient world. It's just nowhere to be found. There's zero trace of it. There's no other pagan nations that ever referred to Lucifer. So when you go back to the Hebrew, it says Halel. All right. So not Hallel. All right. That means to praise. That's a different word. But this is Halel. So I have a friend, Dr. Bill Gallagher, who wrote a brilliant paper showing the connection between Halel in Hebrew with the Akkadian Elil. So Akkadian is an old Semitic language, so people know. And then that probably came from the Sumerian, which is probably the oldest language that we know of, certainly the oldest written language, where you have Enlil. And Enlil was sort of the Zeus of Mesopotamia, if you will. And he was everywhere. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is incredible, right? So if we can show a connection between Halel, where, you know, God through the prophet Isaiah is speaking about his demise and how he tried to, you know, overthrow God and all this stuff, that this one known as Enlil is the one who was trying to do that. I mean, the light bulbs just went off in my head, right? I'm like, oh my goodness, this is incredible, right? And so now we find Satan everywhere. I mean, he's all over the ancient world. He's just never called Satan. He's never called Lucifer, because Lucifer is really a misunderstanding of the word, and Satan is just a title.
Exactly.
Right? He's just
not his name.
Yeah, it's not his name. So he's everywhere. All right. I'm like, wow, okay, that's pretty cool. Now, as I'm researching Enlil, I'm coming across, of course, what is called his logogram. So a logogram is kind of like a cartouche. If people are maybe familiar with that, you know, the Egyptian kings would have a sort of their own symbol, and you could see that, and you're like, oh, that's, you know, that's basically so-and-so's icon. It's kind of like the Nike swoop, you know, like you see that and you're like, oh, Nike. You see the golden arches, you think McDonald's. I mean, it's just branding is really what it is. And so this kind of like McDonald's, you say golden arches, it's not the word McDonald's, but it's a different name, but you understand what it refers to. So this logogram has the name of the logogram is Bod. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is kind of interesting, right? So I start getting this idea. I'm like, maybe Bod and Bot, they're exactly the same. Could that be that there's this word that was transliterated into Greek? I'm thinking, oh, this is a far-fetched idea, right? And I know enough Sumerian to be a little bit dangerous. Okay, so I'm not an expert.
More of a nut.
Well,
anybody use that as a brag before? I like that. I know enough Sumerian to be dangerous.
I can read Sanskrit, by the way.
I just want to make it clear if there are any scholars out there, I'm not a Sumerian scholar. Okay, you know, but so anyway, I tracked down a real Sumerian scholar, Amar Anus, out of Finland, and I'm like, okay, I said, I have this idea, but I need to check it. Okay. And I thought, so I told him about my idea that, you know, could it be? And I'm sort of like sheepishly, I'm like, you know, I don't know, maybe I'm stupid, you know, but I got this idea. Okay. And I was like, you know, could it be that somehow Bod was transliterated into Greek and put on this stele? And so he starts telling me about there's this evidence of this other word, haruspex, which is a word that was used in southern Italy for a liver seer, right? And a lot of linguists, they're like, you know, specs, that's pretty obvious, like you have spectacles and whatever for seeing. But then haru, they're like, what in the world is this thing? So, you know, long story short, it turns out that this is actually coming from Sumerian. It was the logogram name of the liver. And this was a vocation that was imported into Italy from Mesopotamia, because that was the thing back then, is that, you know, if you were a king and you wanted to know, hey, should I go to war or not? Then you'd call the local liver seer, and he would, you know, take a lamb, open up its liver and kind of inspect it and say, well, based on this, yes, you should go to war, king, and you're going to succeed. All right. I mean, it was just superstition, of course.
Yeah, but they did it. Yeah.
But that's what they did, you know. And so here you have evidence of a word taken from Sumerian brought into southern Italy. So so, you know, he's like, I think you're onto something. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is really exciting, right? So the bottom line here is that I think we have probably the oldest extra biblical mention of Satan's code name in the world, and it was found right there on Mount Hermon. All right, so the translation then, it should be according to the command of the greatness personified God, Batios, those taking an oath proceed from here. And I'm like, wow, that is powerful. And understand that Mount Hermon is 9,300 feet above sea level.
Yeah.
All right. Now, I live in Colorado, and a lot of time people are doing 14ers, right? I myself have done one, but let's be honest. I started at 12,000 feet. Okay. I drove my car up to the parking lot, and then I walked the rest of the way. It was still a trek, but we're talking about people that are starting at sea level, and they're going up 9,000 feet. Wow. Right. And they're carrying this big, heavy stone, this stele, to take it to the top of this temple that's up there. And so why would they do that unless it really was a significant place?
Yeah.
I think it was. I mean, it doesn't absolutely prove it, but it does tell you that from a long time ago, people were memorializing this particular place, and they thought it was super important, and important enough to create a stele, to put the secret name of Batios up there, and to let people know. And the scribes in the ancient world, they understood that Dagon and Baal and Marduk, these were all the same guy, right? And so what they would do is they would just use the logogram sort of as the shorthand, because they didn't feel like having to write, the different names all the time. They're like, we're all talking about the same guy. Mm-hmm. And so they would just put that icon, that symbol representing the God with different names, but the same God. And so that's what they were doing. And there we have it now on that stele.
Well, Doug, I find this very interesting because it's the same God, different names. And we know, according to scripture, that happened at Babel. The names were scattered. So it's almost like this false religion came into effect, and then the name changed when everybody's languages changed. And we know that the source behind that Tower of Babel was Nimrod. And he was the founder of Erech, Akkad, of Sumer, of Nineveh, all these cities. And you found a connection with Nimrod and this story, and him possibly having that Nephilim connection. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Nimrod, I don't think we have his real name. I think the Bible's like, your name isn't Nimrod. That Nimrod means let's rebel. Who's going to name their kid let's rebel?
Well, exactly.
Hey, let's rebel. Clean your room. No, I mean,
he did all the time.
Yeah,
so we could call it
even bad parents want their kids to behave, right? And so Nimrod is an epithet. It is a statement of who you are. Yeah. Okay. We might do this with maybe a mafia boss or somebody like that. We use a description to talk about what they were like, and not necessarily, what their actual name was. Mm-hmm. So I think probably his name has been lost to us, quite possibly. Huh. But we find Nimrod all over the ancient world. And again, if you look for Nimrod, you're probably not going to really find him. But if you understand how to translate, or how to sort of make the connection to other languages, you're like, oh, wow, this is, again, mind-blowing. So we take those root letters of his name. So the noon at the beginning just means let's. Mm-hmm. And then you're left with Mem Resh Dalet. All right, Marad. Marad means to rebel. So we take those root letters, and then we start finding it all over the place. So he was known as Nin Urta in the ancient world, which means Lord of the earth. Nin is Lord, Urta means earth, kind of like the word Eretz in Hebrew. Mm-hmm. So those are very similar. So he was known as Lord of the earth. And the Bible's like, no, I don't think so. You are not Lord of the earth. You're the rebel. Okay. Yep. But we do find those same root letters in the god Marduk.
That's right.
Okay. All right. So Marduk, and also the god of the Amorites. Remember the Amorites, God said to Abram, hey, know for certain that your descendants will be slaves, and then I'm going to take them out in the fourth generation, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And I've always wondered, like, well, what were they doing for 400 years? I think they were turning themselves into Nephilim, essentially. The name of their god is Martu. And I'm like, oh my goodness, Martu. All right. Now, for those who speak Spanish, we know that, you have Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, or you have Martes, right? Martes is the god Mars. And it turns out that the name Mars is not actually Latin, but it came from a different language. Where did it come from? Drum roll, please. It came from Akkadian, where you have Martu or Marduk, right? T's and D's are absolutely the same when we start talking about roots, right? So Martes, Martu, Marduk, Nimrod, Marad, right? It's all the same guy. And so he was known as Ninurta, the Lord of the Earth. So you have the Nun and the Mem are the same, then Marad, right? So you have the same root there. And again, this is where the story, the plot thickens. Okay, so Enlil has a son named Ninurta. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is crazy. All right, and so let's go back a little bit. We've got to go back and set the stage a little bit more, because Enlil never claimed to be the creator god. He was the god who quite proudly claimed to be the usurper god. It was Anu, the creator god, the god of heaven. Anu literally means heaven. And Enlil, boasts that he stole the tablet of destinies, which gave him the Anu-ship, right? Which gave him the authority of Anu over mankind and the affairs of men. And then the tablet of destinies was Enlil's, and he could give it to whoever he wanted to. So who does he give it to? He gives it to his son, Ninurta.
Wow.
And you're like, ooh, okay. All right. Now, remember, let's fast forward now to Revelation, where the dragon is going to give the beast his power, throne, and his great authority. Yes. Right. Now, last I checked, Satan's kind of a selfish dude, doesn't like to share very much, doesn't share his toys with others, unless it benefits him. Okay. Yeah. So why would the dragon give the beast his power, throne, and authority? I mean, that's kind of the whole kit and caboodle, right? I mean, that's everything.
Unless he was offspring.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's something in it for Satan, very much so. There's something in it. And so we go back to, Genesis chapter 10, and there's some weird language in the scripture. All right. So Genesis chapter 10, it's talking about how Nimrod came along, right? So Cush begot Nimrod. All right. So we know that Nimrod comes from just regular human stock. But then something weird happens. Okay. It says that he began to be a mighty one on the earth.
Gibor.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. A Gibor. Right. So, and it says, Hu hechel lichiot Gibor ba'aretz. All right. So that right there, in fact, the word Gibor ba'aretz, I think really, I didn't even say this in my book. It just came to me right now. But Gibor ba'aretz, I think that is actually a reference to Nin Urta. Okay, so again, Nin being Lord, and then or mighty one, Lord, ruler, and then Urta and Eretz are exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
But in any event, the word Gibor, it doesn't always mean a Nephilim, but it can mean a Nephilim. And we see that in Genesis chapter 6, that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. These were the mighty men of old. These were the, Anshe Giborim. Okay, so these are the Giborim. David had some Giborim, and I don't think that they were Nephilim. Yeah. All right. But it says in the Greek concerning Nimrod that he became a Gigas, right? And a Gigas is a giant, or it's a not not necessarily giant. We think of somebody who's really tall,
Yeah.
and that could be okay, but that's not really the main emphasis of the word. The word gigas is actually it means earthborn, but in the context, if you start looking in the Greek literature, it's always somebody who is a demigod. It's somebody who is earthborn as opposed to heavenly, because their father was heavenly, and then of course their mother is a woman, right? A human woman. Okay, let's put it that way. So that's what happened. But something is different about Nimrod, right? He doesn't follow the same pattern of where the sons of God came down and they took women and then they produced. They had children, known as the Nephilim. So somehow Nimrod is different. And he became this mighty hunter before the Lord. Okay, what? He's just really good at shooting deer or something?
I asked the same question.
Or was he somehow different? Now, what's really interesting is there is a lot of scholarly literature. I just want people to know I'm not making this stuff up. It's not just, me like, I think this is how it should be. I researched this stuff. I have a 500 footnotes in Corrupting the Image Volume 2. I did some hardcore research. So just, maybe for people that were wondering, oh my goodness, did you do real research? I tried to. Okay. So there's a lot of connections between Gilgamesh and Ninurta. All right. So Gilgamesh, what basically means the mighty hero. He stood about 18 feet tall. There's actually a statue of Gilgamesh in the Louvre in France, and he's holding what looks like a chihuahua, but it's actually a lion. Okay. You're like, oh wow, okay, so
that's his chihuahua.
so lions are like 400 500 pounds, somewhere in there, and he's just kind of holding it like this, like a woman would hold a little chihuahua or something, right? And you're like, okay, something's kind of weird. So this guy, according to the text and according to the actual statue of him, was 18 feet tall. He went to the Mesopotamian version of Noah, Utnapishtim, and he wanted to find the source of immortality, just in case the flood ever happened again. What's amazing is you start looking at these ancient texts, and they just assume that everybody knows that there was a flood.
You know what they're talking about.
Yeah, just like we all know about Hiroshima. You say Hiroshima, you're like, well, of course, there was a nuclear bomb, right? Everybody on planet Earth that's mildly studied knows about Hiroshima, right? And so everybody in the ancient world knew that there was a flood. All right, so Gilgamesh and Ninurta seem to be related. And then there was another guy named Pabilsag. He seems to be the another name for hero. So there's all these different epithets for him, all these different various names for him, but he's all really the same guy. He's also known as Martu, the god of the Amorites, and all this stuff, right? So there's just a lot of connections, and that's partly what is exciting and also partly what's a little bit challenging. We also find him in 2 Kings chapter 19, where it says that Sennacherib II was in his temple worshiping Nisroch.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So he was worshiping Nisroch. Nisroch is almost certainly just a scribal error. So just think of Nimrod versus Nisroch. Once you understand what the letters look like, you're like, oh, okay. That would pretty easily could happen if you're just not paying, close attention. So scholars are pretty much agreed that Nisroch is, in fact, Nimrod. So what's he doing worshiping Nimrod? Okay. Well, Nimrod, Ninurta, same dude, Martu, Marduk, they're all the same guy. So this takes us back to the question, what was the iniquity of the Amorites? Well, I think Satan wanted to kind of give a housewarming gift when the Israelites came into the land of Canaan. And, he had this whole Nephilim thing going on, but it wasn't the way it was before the flood. That got them in a lot of trouble. I think the new program was for fully humans to decide that they wanted to become a Gibor. And the way that they did that was through Nimrod. So Nimrod really became the first fully human individual to become a hybrid, to become a demigod. And now the exact way that this happened is not absolutely clear in Scripture, but we do have some pretty exciting clues. All right, so who was the first person called the son of perdition? Well, Judas, of course, right?
Okay,
yeah. And
right.
of course, we know the Antichrist is also called the son of perdition. So what's the connection there? Well, let's kind of go back. What happened with Judas? Well, at some point, he sort of made the full commitment to Satan. And it says that Satan entered into Judas. Okay. Right. So when Jesus is there with the disciples and they're breaking bread at the Last Supper, Satan is there, right? He's in Judas. I know, right? I mean, mind blown, right? I'm just like, oh my goodness, that's crazy. So, so all of this stuff is happening, and he's a son of perdition. So what could have happened? What I would suggest is that when Satan possesses somebody, or any demon possesses someone, that not only are they in there and their spirit is in their body, however that happens, but I think given enough time that this person would then start to be transformed. Okay. And I base this on some really wild research of a guy named Chris, I'll just call him Chris L, out of Reno, Nevada. And he had leukemia and he needed a bone marrow transplant. So some German made a donation and he got this bone marrow transplant. So there was a forensics lab that wanted to follow him genetically before and after, right? So they start following Chris and they find that after about 3 months, the DNA in his blood has changed to that of his donor. And then after some time, they find that the DNA in his semen has turned to that of his donor, right? And so Chris is on record saying, it's pretty wild that I can disappear and someone else can take my place. So, there's something there that I can't fully understand, how this happens.
A spirit parasitically taking over the host.
Yes.
And in their DNA, a transhuman act. We do it through genetics today, but it's done spiritually. That's blows my mind.
Well, and so this takes us back to Corrupting the Image Volume 1. So I did a lot of research on what is seed. And that was a question that I'm just like, okay, what is a seed? I'm thinking watermelon seed or sunflower. Like I've seen those, right? Put those in the ground myself and out comes some fruit. But what is this thing? So, once you get below the husk, you get down to the kernel, and then you get down to, chromosomes, genes, DNA. I'm like, okay, I can still see these things, but what's making them work? Well, then you get down to the double helix, you get down to the nucleic acids, A, G, T, and C. But still, what is there? Well, there's a code in there. And I learned this from Dr. Werner Gitt. He talks about in his book, In the Beginning Was Information. And information is a non-material entity that requires a physical medium. And it was like, bingo, that's it, right? A non-material entity that requires a physical medium. Right. And we understand this, we've got our cell phones and, we're transferring data packets, non-material information. We're transferring this all the time, but it requires a physical medium. Even the cloud out there, there's a server out there, a server farm out there that takes real electricity. It's on real machines, so there is no cloud, so to speak. Right. It exists very much in a data center. But the information that the data center is holding is all non-material, right? And again, wow, this is pretty amazing stuff. So, and even says in 1 John 3:9, no one having been born of God continues to sin, for his seed, his sperma resides in him, right? Again, mind blown. Peter talks about how when we're born again, that we have an incorruptible seed and not the corruptible seed, but we have to have this incorruptible seed that's put in us. So we're talking about God's information, right? So God has information. The demons have information. God even says back in Genesis 3:15, I will cause enmity between you, Satan, and the woman, between your seed and her seed. Right. And that's what started me in this whole quest. I'm like, what the heck is going on there? How can Satan have seed? Right. And I got to Genesis 6 and all this other stuff. And I'm like, oh, yeah, there's definitely seed, because seed is information. And seed, as we now know today, does not require there to be procreation. It does not require, physical, sexual union between a man and a woman. We can now do this in the laboratory. Even a virgin birth is entirely possible today. A woman could have it, right? She could actually, in fact, there may be some, lesbians or whoever that, don't want intimacy with a man and they want a kid, and bada boom, bada bing, they go get some DNA, some sperm from a sperm bank, and they're pregnant. Okay. So it's no longer the miracle that it used to be. And it's still a miracle. It's pretty cool that we can do that. But, God had the idea first. And, so this kind of bringing it all together, right? Nimrod was the rebel who became the first hybrid. And I think what happened is that Satan basically possessed him for an indefinite amount of time. That began a transformation. There's something in quantum physics known as quantum entanglement, that you can actually put two particles so close together that they become entwined with one another. And then when you have a change in one, there's automatically a change in the other. So I actually think that there was a quantum entanglement that happened between Satan and Nimrod, and that Nimrod became the living, breathing avatar for Satan, right? And, he lived for hundreds of years. He was a god in the eyes of the ancient world. And, he was a god. He was superhuman. He was not your regular human. He was very much a step above, and he became a mighty hunter before the Lord. And that's how he was able to found all these different cities. Last I checked, founding a city is kind of a big job.
Yeah.
He's just making them left and right, like, oh, no big deal. So, it's a lot of work, and this would take a man hundreds of years to do this, and probably superhuman strength to boot. So all kinds of stuff looking at Nimrod.
This is interesting to me because you guys are talking deep genius level stuff, and I know that the common person may be watching this and saying, wow, this is really interesting. How does this truly apply? I see so many things that we just attribute in our everyday life. For instance, somebody has an allergy to dairy. They don't know it. Every time I drink milk, I get sick, right? They never investigate beyond symptomatic, things to find out what's really happening. Your theory of saying that some kind of quantum entanglement could happen through Satan possessing him for long enough. Why is it that we look at things like habitual sin and wonder why it's harder and harder and harder to become detangled from sin the longer we spend involved in it? All these things I say about the literal history of where this planet's been shows me that all of the penchants that we deal with as humans and we deal with spiritually is all based on this science. I mean, it is science. It is how the universe was set to run.
I believe it's Paul's great mystery he spoke about. He says concerning Christ and the church, he's talking about union between a man and a woman. How can they become one? Well, physically, we don't see that, but spiritually somehow they become one person. Just like we become spiritually one with Messiah when we are crucified, our spirit is reborn. So there's something to that. Satan knew that possibility. And like you said, he corrupted it. He corrupted the image of God, of what he knew God was going to plan with that prophecy in Genesis 3:15 of the seed. And there was that. It continues on. And you've written that it most probably continues on with the beast. I've always referred to the beast as the last Nimrod. Here's this perfect, chimera mixing of animals. And even in Daniel chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar sees that image, you see the toes that represent the 10 kings, and says they will mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another. I mean, there's genetics going on here. Is that not the case?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, I translated that they will hybridize themselves.
Oh,
because just kind of putting it into modern speak, sometimes we have to take the Bible and just say, okay, what would be the modern equivalent of this, right? They didn't have words like DNA and that kind of stuff back then. But clearly they knew what a seed was. They understood the basics of it, and certainly God understands it, right? So, seed is not really a wrong word. It's and in fact, what's kind of crazy is when you start looking at some of our high-tech words, it's just kind of goes back to seed, right? I mean, sperm, what is sperm? It's just the word for seed. All right. So we understand a bit more, but in some ways we don't know too much more. It's kind of funny that way. So I definitely think that Daniel 2:43 is talking about these kings who are going to hybridize themselves with the seed of men. That tells you that they are not of the seed of men. That's why it says seed of men, because they who are the kings are going to mingle, hybridize themselves with the seed of men. It's the word, the Aramaic word there is mitarvin. And you have this word leharev, lehariv, which is to basically stir, to you take a couple things, you put it in some water and you stir it up, you mix it, and then you have a compound, right? And that's the whole idea, is that you have these two dissimilar things, you're putting them into some mixture, then mixing them up, but it actually is in the reflexive, so that the kings, are going to mingle themselves with the seed of men. Right. And so, I mean, there's all kinds of little clues in there, right? It's not always like an airtight case, drop the mic, we've got this thing figured out. But there's often a lot of little clues in the text. You're like, I wonder, right? And then we start kind of looking at some modern equivalents. That's why I think Chris out of Reno, Nevada is so interesting, because, he had a bone marrow transplant, and Chris genetically has started to disappear. And, I can only wonder, what are the implications if he has kids? Will they be his? Will they be the German donor's kids? I mean, whose DNA will these children actually have? Right. And that is where I think we're going to come to the mark of the beast. This is where I think, Satan has a big plan. This is why I called my books Corrupting the Image, because I think his ultimate plan is to remove the image of God, the information of God that we were created with, and replace it with his own information, his own seed. I think that's the big plan. And once that happens, once you're no longer of the seed of Adam and of the seed of God,
you're cut off. You can't go.
You're cut off. There's no hope, right? It even says in Hebrews that God gives aid to the descendants of Abraham, but to the angels, nope, sorry, right? You're on a different sphere altogether. And this is why I think taking the mark of the beast and worshiping his image and worshiping his name, like, these are so incredibly dangerous. And this is why an angel says, if anybody does this, you are in big, 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 big trouble, right? And there's no going back.
Which that goes back to your original point, which is you started off saying, everybody says, how could a good God do this? It wasn't about God's goodness. It was about them no longer being a son of God. Their DNA that they've chosen is now altered, right, now in Satan, and he can't have that with him up there in heaven. And so it had nothing to do with him being bad or mean, just as it won't be if they take the mark of the beast going forward. And another point that you brought up to bring this in here, you said that during those time periods, everybody knew certain things. They all knew about the flood. They all knew about this. One of the things I've always felt that the enemy's greatest tool has been is that if you are an adversary that nobody believes exists, you have no opposition. And so he erased his history over time to where we look at all the history of everything we're talking about as folklore, right? He's about it and stuff like that, but nobody wants to believe that any of that existed in any capacity. And so he gets less opposition. But now we almost shift to where we're beginning to glorify this stuff. Everything kids today and all the movies and the cultures come out, things with aliens and everything. I know you have a lot to say about this. We're shifting the generation back into worshiping the idea of all of this transhuman, demonic stuff as now these are gods. Tell me a little bit about
full circle.
Yeah, well, and I just wanted to say, about the loving God, if we put it into a zombie movie context, it becomes very easy to understand. You may love your family dearly, but once they become infected with the zombie virus,
take them out.
They're zombies, and
I like that.
And so that's kind of what happened is there was a zombification of the human race. I don't know if every last person became a zombie, but a lot of people did, and only 8 people made it onto the boat safely. Wow. And so you put it in sort of that modern context of a zombie movie, you're like, oh, okay. So basically everybody on the planet got infected with the zombie virus and God had to wipe them out and start over, right? That's the basic idea of what we're talking about. And I think that's where we're headed. In fact, we even see it in Revelation 16 that those who take the mark are going to have these putrid sores coming out of them. And in Revelation 9, it says that men are going to seek death and it's going to flee from them. I mean, suicide is a very sad thing. People do it every day. They're very successful at it, unfortunately. So how can it be that people cannot actually kill themselves successfully? I would argue because they become hybrids, they become immortal. And then once they get it, they're like, maybe this wasn't a good idea. Maybe it wasn't a good idea.
Punish him. Yeah.
Right. So now, okay, how do we get here? Right. How in the world will the world fall for this?
Yeah.
Well, I think the 2 witnesses are going to come. They're going to call humanity back to God. Humanity at large and say, no way, Jose, we're not interested. We don't want that old stuffy God who doesn't let us do our stuff. And the problem, though, is that the 2 witnesses come with superpowers. Okay. Yeah. They're not just pushovers, right? They can strike the earth with plagues as often as they desire. They can stop it from raining for 3.5 years, and they can turn the waters into blood. So the world is going to, just have an incredible hatred for these guys, and they're going to rejoice. They're going to party, send gifts to each other when they're finally dead, right? That is how epic these guys are going to be. And let's think about it. Let's put it in context for a second. The United States has the most powerful military in the world. We've got the Navy SEALs and snipers and all kinds of stuff and cool gadgets and tanks and F-16s and F-26s and whatever, right? All that stuff. Or 36s, whatever we're up to nowadays. I have no idea. Okay. So, we've got some pretty impressive gadgets that can do a lot of destruction. And here you have 2 guys that the world can't stop.
Yep.
What's up with that? All right. And then we're told that the beast who comes up out of the abyss is going to kill the 2 witnesses. Oh, so this guy is more powerful than them. And then the world says, who can make war with the beast? Who can make war with the beast? Yeah. Great question, right? Because the whole world tried to make war with the 2 witnesses and failed. Yeah. Nobody could stop them. In fact, they could have fire come out from their mouths whenever they choose. I tend to think that it's fire coming down from heaven, just like Elijah did. But, we'll have to wait and see how that actually plays out. But
spit and fire. Yeah.
Exactly. Whether, it's from their mouth directly or when they call it down from heaven, either way, they're unstoppable. That's the point. They are unstoppable until this one dude comes along called the beast, and then he's able to stop them. So how can this happen? This is where I think that in the future, there'll be a man who is just naturally born as a human, but he hates God for whatever reason. He thinks Satan is really awesome. And he's then going to mingle himself with Satan. But the story on the ground for the world has not been that, hey, Satan just mingled with some guy. It's that, no. We, the ancient aliens, have been here. We've been watching over planet Earth. We've been kind of quiet because we want to let you guys evolve naturally and all this different stuff. But we've been here watching, and in case anything cataclysmic should ever happen, we've been here to kind of save the day. And haven't we seen this in like every alien movie out there? Okay, if they're good aliens. You know, I mean, I saw this in the movie Knowing, where the Earth is about to be destroyed, but the good, nice aliens show up, and they're gonna take you know, 2 of every boy and girl from around the world and put them on new planets. Whereas, you know, there's a frequent mention of God and Jesus, who do nothing. They do nothing. But the aliens come and they save the day. Marvel's Eternals, that was the same whole thing, you know, that, and they said that, you know, it was the god Marduk, and it was the god, you know, all these different gods.
He doesn't hide his plans. It's just all out in the open.
Yeah. We've been hanging out, just sort of, you know, protecting the Earth from, what were they called? The something or others, you know, these other bad gods. And so, you know, we've been here to watch over you guys. All right. So that's the basic idea. And so I think what's going to happen is all of the UFO sightings, all the alien talk, and all of that is going to finally come into focus when the 2 witnesses come on the scene. And then I think that is when the actual disclosure is going to happen. By the way, I'm kind of describing my book, Regenesis Code. All right. That is a novel. So if people don't want to wade through all of the facts and figures that I bring to you in Corrupting the Image 1, 2, and 3, it's now available, and a fun and exciting story, Regenesis Code, which I am working on and praying that this will become a serialized movie, sort of like a Netflix series kind of thing.
Yes.
You know, because that's, people are watching movies, right? They're not going to church. They're not reading the Bible as much as they should, but they are watching movies. And so let's get it in front of them in a language and a format that they really love. So basically, this is when our whole alien disclosure thing happens. And then the Antichrist, the beast, you know, he's here. I'm here to help you and save you. And then he's going to, you know, sacrifice himself to become this superhuman so that he can fight those bad guys. Right. That's the basic story. And that's what I think is going to happen. But guess what? The bad guys, I mean, the 2 witnesses, the good guys, right? It's always flipping the script. So those 2 witnesses are going to resurrect. And what happens? The Earth freaks out. Oh no, right? Oh no. And you know, it's funny, you can read the Bible so many times you don't see things, right? And then I'm like, wait a second. It says right here that the whole earth is coming together to make war against the Lamb, right? I mean, that is their concerted effort. They're coming to make war with him. It's not just like, oh, we were just here and you showed up. They're like, no, we're coming to make war with you, Jesus. Now, this, I think, is the strong delusion, right? You've got to be seriously deluded to think you can make war with the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. But the delusion is that he's not the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. What is Jesus really? He's he's an ancient alien. He's the one we don't like.
That aliens we don't like. Yeah.
You know, yes, he's very powerful. We don't deny that. He's very powerful, but so is Enlil, right? So is this other ancient alien dude, right? And it turns out this ancient alien named Enlil has been fighting for humanity. He's been fighting for our freedom. He's been trying to help us out and to liberate us from this other dude that, you know, clearly this genocidal maniac that we find in the Hebrew Bible named Yahweh or Jesus or whatever, you know, God, Elohim, whatever you want to call him. He's that bad guy. And clearly he's a real blankety blank because, you know, he brought about the flood. We were just all getting together, having a good old time back at Babel. And guess who came and disrupted everything? Yeah, it was that guy, you know, that God of the Old Testament that we don't like so much. So, you know, yes, they acknowledge him as the God of the Bible, but we know what they think about him. They've written as much. You know, they've told us we don't like him. And, you know, so he sent his 2 goons to come and try to whip us into shape and to get us to bow the knee to him. We're not going to do it, you know? So what's the solution? How do we fight against this guy? Well, you got to fight fire with fire. You know, human weapons, tanks, guns, planes, they're not going to do anything. We all need to upgrade. We need to become gods ourselves. We need to evolve now. Okay. And everybody must evolve. If we, the human race, all evolve, if all 8 billion of us or whatever, all evolve, we can beat him. We can send him back to where he came from. Right. And so now you have a mandate that the world must participate in. Hey, we're going to let you do it voluntarily. But then we start seeing some resistance, oh, you don't want to do it. Well, you can't buy or sell. You can't be part of this Babel system that we have going on. You don't get to enjoy the perks. Oh, you still don't want to be part of this? You know what? You're a traitor. You're a traitor to humanity. You're siding with those guys. You're siding with the ones that want to destroy the human race. Hey, there's no place for you on this earth. And so you must be taken out. We're going to do it nicely. And this is a little twist. This is my little theory. Yeah. All right. I think that they're probably going to, they're going to execute people, maybe with firing squads, maybe with lethal injection, whatever. But then the believers who've been paying attention and they were watching what the two witnesses were doing, they're like, oh yeah, that is our birthright. We have, we're deputized to do the same kinds of things that Jesus was doing. He told us as much, but we've forgotten our heritage. And the two witnesses have sort of kicked us in the butt and gotten us back on track. And I think people are going to go out and start healing people and actually bringing back the dead. Yeah. In a way like we've never seen before. And so I think my theory is that after they execute people for not taking the mark, and then other believers bring them back to life, I think they're going to say, you know what, we need to kill them and make sure they stay dead. And so off with their heads.
That's where the beheading comes from. You hear about in Revelation, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think it's just, random. I'm always wanting to look for what is the reason behind this. There has to be a reason. And once you put it into a context, like a real context. And what's amazing about writing a story is it's really forced me to take some of these bullet point theologies that we've had. I call it sort of the outline, or your PowerPoint presentation. It's relatively easy to have your points of theology or eschatology, present those at a conference or something, but you never have to put skin on it. You never have to say, okay, how does this actually work in the real world? And so writing a story has forced me to do that, because I'm like, wait a second, what is really going on with the mark of the beast, or not buying or selling, and all these different things. And so then I have to see it, and then you start seeing these progressions, right? Because it goes from just getting the mark, then you can't buy or sell, and then eventually we see in Revelation 20 that those who didn't take it lose their heads. So what happened, right? And so that's where you have to fill in. You got to use a little holy imagination to kind of fill in some of the gaps, right? So I don't claim it's inspired.
Yeah.
But I think it's incredibly reasonable to start thinking, how you get from A to B.
This is probably the most plausible, convincing argument. You deliver it so elegantly, and even though it's a lot of information, I come away from this feeling like I get the whole picture now. And that's what I love about storytelling in general, and why I actually want to go read your book now. I started listening to it on tape on your YouTube. It's like 10 hours long. I've started, but that's what's so exciting to me, is that stories have that way of ingraining the concepts into you. And that's, again, movies. Can you imagine releasing this movie and then somebody goes, wait a minute, that's Jim. I saw Jim over there in the corner. I think he's becoming the beast. It puts so many concepts, not going to happen, but it puts so many concepts into just this reality, because it's so easy for us today to just look at it and go, man, that's just over spiritualizing something. That's just theological babble or whatever. Yeah. But everything that you've talked about in laying out this plan, it's not that we're just saying this stuff so that we can be afraid of the future or that we can all bunker up, but you have to understand how the enemy thinks, how he's been thinking, and how he's been setting this up since the very beginning, to know that this is a serious battle. We've been involved in a war the entire time, and we have a purpose. and God wants something out of us to be able to stand up and fight and know what's going on and not just be sheep. So everything you said is incredible. And I'm sure that people watching this are going to want to know how they can find more information from you.
Your website, or
where can they find more information? I know you said you have a church, you have books, a movie potentially. Tell everybody how we can find out more about the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so you can go to my website, douglashamp.com. You can also go to Amazon and look me up there. So just Douglas Hamp on Amazon. I've got about 13 books now. So Regenesis Code is my latest. I'm very, very excited about it. But let me just say, I did a tremendous amount of research in Corrupting the Image volumes 1, 2, and 3. So, what comes across, obviously there's a lot of fiction in it, no question about it, because you have to make a good story and all that. But as far as sort of the hard facts, those are things that I really did dig up, and I'm pretty excited about presenting those. So I'm also the pastor of the Way Congregation in Lakewood or Denver, Colorado. So people can find us at thewaycongregation.com. And if they want to join us, we'd love to meet them. If they're locals here or if they're just visiting, do come and join us every Saturday at 10:30 a.m. and go to the Way Congregation for more information about that.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
One of the reasons why I wanted to just harp on the fact of how we can hear from people like you is that I've often felt throughout my life, where are the other people besides my brother who are spending their whole life trying to find this stuff, because the information seems so hard to find. But knowing there are people like you out there who've dedicated their lives and 13 books and countless hours, it gives me so much hope. And I want to be able to direct people. I want to be able to say, look, I don't know everything about this. I'm going to be honest with you, but I know a guy, and I know another guy. I need to go. So thank you. I just want to say thank you for being faithful in everything that you've done, for taking the time today to speak to us.
Yes.
We all have one mission, right? And that's spread the name of Yeshua.
Yes.
And I love the way you're doing it. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.